Along the shores of the Elbe and Rhine rivers lay situated a group of people which influenced modern and ancient European history like no other. Through centuries of conquest, war, empire, extremely complicated feudal and religious law, revolutions and breakthroughs in the fields of science, technology, psychology, arts, music, and religion, several decades of ideological tyranny and mass destruction as a result of heavy war accusations and a national crisis, followed by unprecedented amounts of economical growth and cultural and moral awakening, currently holding the title as the nation, leading Europe and the world towards prosperity, fueled by hard work, democracy, and an objective and constructive view on the past. The Germans have had quite a remarkable impact on the history of the old continent. Meine Damen und Herren, das ist die Geschichte Deutschlands. Stemming from the Proto-Germanic people groups from Scandinavia, what are to become labeled as the continental Germanic tribes settled in northern Europe on the shores of the North and Baltic Sea and the Elbe and Rhine rivers. Their northern counterparts came to develop into what we today know as the Nordic and Scandinavian peoples, while still having significant impact on the cultural and linguistic development of the continental Germanic tribes, along with the Slavs, Balts, and Celts, who they found roaming around the old continent upon their arrival. These continental Germans were at the time quite different in their culture, traditions, and language, and included what we today know as Goths, Vandals, Franks, Lombards, Saxons, and others. These Germanic tribes played a big role in the ethnic extinction of the Celts, which were previously situated in Central Europe, coexisting with the Romans, who labeled the incoming Germanic settlers as barbarians, as they were seen as foreign and non-Roman. The Germans had plenty of contact with the Roman Empire through war, invasions, plunderings, as well as migrations, like the one during the Great Migration period, where the Germanic tribes, exiled and displaced by the invading Huns from the east, were forced to migrate to Roman lands, which further contributed to the decline and eventual fall of the Roman Empire. With the fall of Rome, many of the Germanic tribes established rule over many areas in Europe, with the Goths ruling over expansive territories in Iberia, the Balkans, and modern Italy, and the Franks and Burgundians in modern France. But by far the greatest force was exercised by the Franks and the Frankish Empire, soon with Karl der Große or Charlemagne, who has always controversially been claimed by both the French and Germans, as he was seen as a romanticized idol who conquered Europe and gave it a Germanic undertone. After being crowned King of Franks in 768, Charlemagne conquered vast amounts of land and established power in Europe ruthlessly while expanding his kingdom. His military expansions acquired him the title of the King of Lombards in 774 and finally Emperor of the Romans or Imperator Romanum in year 800. His death followed in a big dispute between the heirs to the throne, leading to the collapse of the Frankish Empire and the dissolution of the Carolingian dynasty. With the Treaty of Adon in 843, following a 3-year civil war, Middle, East, and West Francia were formed, with the Western realm later developing into what we today know as France, the Middle into Italy, and the Western realm under Ludwig der Deutsche or Louis the German into, well, Germany. The ruler that brought the German duchies their former glory was Otto the Great, who was after admirable conquest crowned King of Germany in 936, King of Italy in 961, and finally named Roman Emperor 1 year later, which marked the start of a new era in German history. This newly founded Holy Roman Empire was, besides not being Holy Roman or an empire, basically a loosely defined and extremely complicated cluster of small duchies and principalities in a delicate balance of powers, which were much under the influence of the Catholic Church and the Holy See in Rome, but had nothing to do with Roman and Italian culture, as most of this empire was of Germanic descent. Furthermore, the emperor himself, the electoral college with the various princes and the foreign powers trying to assert as much influence as possible, and the entire feudal system itself, was fueled by huge amounts of corruption and manipulation coming from the Vatican and everywhere else, which certainly takes the holy part of the name out of the picture. In the meantime, the German states and the HRE discovered their natural talent, which will only become more obvious as we go deeper into their history up to modern day. Merchant guilds across various towns and cities in northern and central Europe, along the Baltic and North Sea, came together in the form of a commercial and defensive alliance known as the Hanseatic League, which was used for strengthening and combining economic assets of these settlements, securing trade routes and economic cooperation, which was becoming necessary as technologies evolved and the world became a more interdependent and intertwined place. The fact that it was signed in Lübeck and Hamburg and used Middle Low German as a lingua franca gives it a clear Germanic undertone, despite being theoretically an international alliance. By looking at religious, economic, and societal reforms and developments, we can firmly conclude that this period of German history was quite turbulent and complicated. To oversimplify, the early High Middle Ages were defined by plenty of church drama, dynastic wars, games of power and influence, with the Hohenstaufen dynasty playing a big role within the empire, which started developing increasingly headache-inducing voting procedures, laws, and relationships, which are too complex even for the biggest of history nerds nowadays. Then the Black Plague came by and decided to clean up the mess in its own fashion, killing between 75 and 200 million people on the old continent and creating a number of religious, economic, and societal upheavals, with profound effects on the course of European history. In Germany, these include the formation of the Bürger class and several other socio-economic subdivisions following the new way of life caused by rapid population growth, new forms of work and production such as guilds, and in general a huge socio-economic rebirth of the Holy Roman Empire. This change in lifestyle brought forth the problem of homeless people and pauperism, which had to be solved in innovative and flexible ways, which include the invention of the Fuggerei, for example. Imperial free cities started becoming a trend, whereas women still played a subordinate and dependent role in society and the family, despite being expected to bring economic and social output and be productive. In year 1517, a monk named Martin Luther published a pamphlet with 95 theses, which he, according to legend, nailed on a church door at the town square in Wittenberg. The contents of these papers were to become one of the most infamous in Christian history, as they initiated the Protestant Reformation by criticizing the corrupt practices of the Roman Catholic Church. With the invention of the printing press and the translation of the Bible into German, this and many other new interpretations of the Word of God spread across the HRE, sparking new ways of thinking and a much more critical look on the corrupt institution which was the Roman Catholic Church. This led to the establishment of the Lutheran Church in 1530, which was unsurprisingly followed by a Catholic counter-reformation with attempts to slow down the conversion and save what they can. Following the ground-shaking Reformation, a series of economic and religious revolts took place, led by the unsatisfied rural classes against ruling feudal lords in 1524. Due to the lack of any military structure, skill, logistics, or equipment, the revolt was shut down by force with grave consequences and costing 100,000 insurgents their lives. The conflict between the Catholics and Protestants was yet to reach its boiling point, as further divisions and tensions between the two factions were yet to escalate. With the attempt of the Emperor to achieve religious unity of the HRE through further discrimination of the Protestants, the Protestant Union stood up for their rights, escalating into a conflict of much wider scale, as foreign and domestic territorial princes joined either side of the conflict, hoping they could conquer some land and establish power out of the looming chaos. The flick of the trigger was a revolt of Protestant nobility in Bohemia, supported by Protestants from other principalities, most notably the Palatinate, Transylvania, and the Netherlands. On the other side stood the Spanish and German branch of the Habsburg dynasties and their subjects, who stood for the protection of the Catholic faith and who managed to crush the revolt till 1625. The first phase of the war also saw the interventions of the Ottomans and England on the side of the initial Protestant rebels, Poland-Lithuania on the side of the Habsburgs, as well as the French Huguenot rebellion. Various other political interests led to further interventions of Denmark, Sweden, Russia, and France, dividing the war into different phases until its end in 1648. As you may see, this war was pure political madness, gradually losing its initial religious motives, and was the first true war of grand scale in Europe. It is extremely complicated and even more extremely oversimplified in this video, as we have many other things to cover. But by looking at the bigger picture, the war ended up being nothing else but a struggle between the French House of Bourbon and its allies against the German House of Habsburg, as a fight for power in Central Europe, with the territories of the Holy Roman Empire and its principalities serving as the battleground. France was Catholic, yet officially backed Denmark in the Protestant opposition in the HRE, which shows that this war was the least about religion. The 30 Years' War ended up being one of the most catastrophic in European history, resulting in an enormous population decline of 38%, more deadly pandemics, increased rates of homicide and rape, plunderings, and witch hunts. The conflict was resolved with the Peace of Westphalia, with which the HRE states were granted more autonomy, power of the emperor was limited, Alsace was lost to France, and several states like the Netherlands and the Swiss Confederation officially left the empire. The aforementioned invention of the printing press led not only to the quick distribution of political and religious propaganda, creating new ideas and agendas in these fields, but also to the evolution of the German language, as early High New German, in which the Protestant revision of the Bible was published, became the nationwide standard, closely resembling the modern standard language. In terms of scientific discoveries, this period is from today's perspective seen as the most influential and critical one for the development of science as we know it today. The invention and implementation of the scientific method on the field of astrology by infamous names such as Copernicus and Johannes Kepler, and other fields of science by other great minds such as Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit, were later on an inspiration for Galileo Galilei in Italy, who, amongst others, set the stage for the greater scientific and intellectual revolution. In 1640, Friedrich Wilhelm, also known as the Great Elector, became ruler of Brandenburg, Prussia. He made sure Prussia was no longer a vassal of Poland and acquired Pomerania with the Treaty of Westphalia after the 30 Years' War. He was then followed by King Friedrich Wilhelm I, who established the structure of a heavily centralized future Prussian state by reorganizing loose and scattered territories and raising a standing army. Friedrich Wilhelm I of Prussia is known as the ruler who made the first steps and paved the path to Prussian dominance over Central Europe for the following decades. The rise of the Prussian state was accompanied by strong population growth, a jump from 16 to 24 million people from the years 1700 to 1800, as well as a widespread application of the scientific method, which led to desperately needed advances in agriculture, which supported greater yields and an overall more profitable production. The higher hygienic standards resulted in a higher birth rate and a lower infant mortality rate, which explains the high population growth. This is the decisive moment when Austria finally got a worthy rival in the struggle for power over the Holy Roman Empire. During this period, the ambitious conquests of Louis XIV of France and his predecessors in German territories led to the formation of the Grand Alliance, led by Austria and consisting of the Dutch Republic, Spain, England and Savoy, with the goal of stopping French tyranny in Central Europe. This conflict, also known as the 9 Years' War, is viewed as the first global war, as it was also fought in India and North America. After financial and military exhaustion on all sides, resulted through battles on all fronts in Europe, an agreement was made with the Treaty of Versailles in 1697, which gave France the entirety of Alsace but forced them to return Lorraine and all lands east of the Rhine. The 9 Years' War was happening simultaneously with the Great Turkish War in southeastern Europe, where the Holy League fought the Ottoman Empire, which was becoming an increasing threat to European stability. The Holy League consisted of Habsburg Austria with the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, Lithuania, Venice, and Russia, and were, so to say, the defenders of Europe and the Christian faith under the leadership of Pope Innocent VI. The alliance won the decisive Battle of Vienna in 1683, disrupting the siege and sensing some relief from the looming threat to European integrity. This paved the path to the conquest of Hungary in 1687 by the Holy League, and after many spectacular battles and maneuvers under supreme command of Prince Eugene of Savoy, they finally defeated the Ottomans and indefinitely changed the balance of power in the Balkans. After the official end of the conflict and the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, the Ottomans escalated another conflict with Austria out of desperation, which led to the Austro-Turkish War, which would last for 2 years. With the Treaty of Passarowitz, Austrian hegemony was indefinitely established over the Balkan Peninsula, and the Ottomans were quickly losing credibility. Back in Prussia, Friedrich II, or Friedrich the Great, was promoting the country to the status of one of the great European powers, mainly through his military genius, competent utilization of the highly disciplined Prussian army, and implementation of the idea of enlightened absolutism. With his achievements, he ended up as a romanticized and glorified role model. Prussia was on an extreme uprise, not only militarily and economically, but especially in terms of controlled territory, which doubled in the past years and gave Prussia the recognition needed to be seen as a power to be reckoned with. These campaigns are to be associated with the War of the Austrian Succession and the Silesian Wars, after which, naturally, Austria saw this new Prussian state as a rival for control over the German states of the Holy Roman Empire and ultimately for influence in European politics. This gave birth to the infamous German dualism and rivalry between Prussia and Austria, around which capital the scattered Germanic peoples are to be unified, Vienna or Berlin, with the HRE slowly losing credibility and states like Bavaria and Saxony also gaining in power. This period was also marked by several Austro-Turkish conflicts as a continuation of the Habsburg-Ottoman rivalry for dominance in the Balkans. Considered as one of the most important movements in the revolution of human reasoning and critical thinking, the Enlightenment was a concept of higher cultural, intellectual, and spiritual standards. It was marked by priceless works of art, music, philosophy, science, and literature, with German as the language of philosophic reasoning, scholarly instruction, and research. Naturally, a counter-movement awoke not much later, opposing the values of Vernunft or reasoning, leading a campaign to promote impulsiveness and the emotional side of human nature under the name of Sturm und Drang and led by Johann Gottfried von Herder. This movement laid the foundation for the upcoming era of Romanticism, as it closely resembles its values. Before the transition into Romanticism, though, the literary movement under the name Weimar Klassik swept across Germany, with classical works of art in the antique as a role model for topics and ideas. Many great minds emerged from this general era of the Enlightenment, with names like Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Friedrich Schiller, and Gotthold Ephraim Lessing on the field of literacy, Johann Sebastian Bach, Joseph Haydn, and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in music, and Immanuel Kant in philosophy. This era is seen as a positive factor in the development of German nationalism, uniting the previously largely disunited German peoples through the means of art and literacy. Women were still largely confined to their homes and assigned the role of a wife, mother, and responsible housekeeper, while still being expected to be economically and socially productive. The revolution in France initially caused mixed reactions in Germany, but saw heavy support by German intellectuals who supported these ideals of the Enlightenment while questioning the power and legitimacy of monarchs. On the other hand, German and other European monarchs were at the same time terrified of and strongly opposed to these revolutionary ideas, which would disrupt their status and legitimacy. After the execution of the French king and the triumph of revolutionaries in France, hopes to see a peaceful spread of these ideals among the Germans lost credibility, which led to numerous attempts of the newly formed French Republic to spread their revolutionary values across Europe, no matter the cost. The tensions and conflicts eventually led to war, as France went against Austria and Prussia, and after initial struggles with counter-revolutionary movements across the country, they ended up intimidating the Germans by conquering lands west of the Rhine, combined with campaigns in Italy. Simultaneously, however, Russia, Prussia, and Austria conducted the three partitions of Poland, known as a series of events that erased Poland from the maps of Europe for decades to come, and dramatically increased the German territories. After his return to France and rise to power as the hero who would save the country from the war exhaustion and bankruptcy, Napoleon Bonaparte took control of the Rhineland, imposed French-style reforms, and abolished the long-lasting feudalism from the HRE, which all had a positive impact and contributed to the modernization of this region. After the War of the Second Coalition and the defeats of Britain, Russia, and Austria, the ancient mess of the Holy Roman Empire was finally abolished by Napoleon, and the Confederation of the Rhine was created as a puppet state. In this state of French domination over Western Europe, Prussia underwent a serious economic, political, and military decline, and tried to stay neutral during the War of the Third Coalition. The War of the Fourth Coalition saw, yet again, Prussia's involvement, which led to a devastating defeat, demilitarization, and heavy war reparations. After Napoleon's military fiasco in Russia and indefinite destruction of the Grand Army, Prussia allied with Russia and Austria to face Napoleon in the War of the final Sixth Coalition. They won at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, but had to invade France and walked into Paris the next year, as Napoleon wasn't ready to admit defeat. With the Congress of Vienna, Prussia came out as one of the biggest winners, gaining a vast amount of territory. Following the chaos caused by the Napoleonic Wars, Europe was in a state of turbulence and exhaustion. With the era of the Enlightenment slowly coming to an end, the balance of powers in the German heartland was disrupted and needed reorganization. This resulted in the formation of the German Confederation, a loose agreement for protection against French and Russian military campaigns, which would once again disrupt the balance of powers in Europe. These developments also gave birth to the Zollverein, which exists today as a way to manage tariffs and economic policies among German territories. With the German revolutions of 1848 and 1849, German nationalism and the question around which empire the pan-Germanic ideal should come to life were brought to the endgame. The period following the chaotic reorganization and unification of German lands saw positive aspects of agricultural productivity and decrease in famine, higher hygienic standards, and decrease in disease outbreaks and epidemics, which all contributed to the staggering 60% population growth, despite the frequent wars. Industrialization solved the problem of pauperism, mass unemployment and hunger, while increasing living standards for the growing middle class. The population growth brought increased urbanization and a need for better infrastructure, with railways blossoming on the easily navigable plains of northern Germany and strongly centralizing the freshly united North German state. On the fields of philosophy, infamous names such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Max Weber, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Engels brought their philosophical and ideological ideas to light. The brothers Grimm were making breakthroughs in literacy, Richard Wagner in opera, and famous musicians such as Ludwig van Beethoven, Franz Schubert, and Robert Schumann, enriching the cultural identity of the Germans. In 1862, King William I named Otto von Bismarck as Prussian minister-president, who came to lift up the German nation to unprecedented heights, with his belief that Germany can only fully be unified through blood and iron. The Second War of Schleswig against Denmark sparked the last conflict between Austria and Prussia and served as a pretext for the 7 Weeks' War, which would, through Prussian victory, once and for all settle the struggle for hegemony, destining Austria to a subordinate role. The German Confederation was dissolved and the Norddeutsche Bund, or the North German Federation, was established, under the leadership of Prussia, serving as a transitional organization until the founding of the German Empire in 1871. Otto von Bismarck was a key figure in the rise of the German Empire, determining the political course with anti-socialist policies and reduction of the strong influence of the Roman Catholic Church through the Kulturkampf. Despite his initial anti-socialist initiatives, in order to shut the socialists up, he went on to issue a set of social laws that included universal healthcare, pension plans, and the other social security policies which define Germany to this day. By 1900, German industrial and economic power had grown to match that of the United Kingdom. Bismarck's complicated and ingenious alliance network and foreign policy was based on preventing a Franco-Prussian alliance and the possibility of being surrounded and forced to fight a two-front war. He did this firstly by allying Austria and Russia in order to isolate France, and then with the dual alliance signed in 1879 with Austria, which ensured mutual military assistance in case Russia went rogue. Italy joined this alliance in 1882 in the search for support surrounding its colonial interests in Africa and the further isolation of France, making the Triple Alliance. Despite Bismarck's repulsion towards the burdens of establishing colonial possessions, he gave away and a number of colonies were established in Africa and Oceania. His initiation of the Berlin Conference of 1885 can be seen as the formalization of the scramble for Africa and new imperialism, as new guidelines and agreements were set for European colonial powers. The new Kaiser Wilhelm II rejected the liberal ideas of his predecessors and embarked upon a conservative autocratic rule. He forced Bismarck into retirement in 1890 and replaced the political elite with plans to personally reshape the inner and foreign policies of the empire with his Weltpolitik. Many would say that Wilhelm II's increasing recklessness and erratic behavior would have to do with his diplomatic incompetence and lack of character, with sketchy and questionable assessments of the Federal Foreign Office for future plans. The carefully constructed network of alliances and diplomatic relations from the Bismarck era was bargained with and eradicated by Wilhelm's reckless and impatient diplomatic policies with Russia and Britain, which led Germany to isolation and full dependence on the Triple Alliance, especially with the official formation of the alliance between Russia and France, which Bismarck was so desperately trying to prevent. A part of Wilhelm II's questionable foreign policy was his obsession with the naval arms race with Britain, where he tried to exert power internationally and force Britain to diplomatic compromises. This, and the obsession over colonial dominance in Africa, led to the two Moroccan crises, where things heated up and a full-blown clash with France was barely avoided, as well as other close calls with Britain, Japan, and the US regarding other possessions. The women of Germany, despite their promotion of male dominance through war and the fatherland theme, enrolled in the Union of German Feminist Organizations, which grew in recognition and encouraged other feminist movements nationwide, and later the growth of international organizations. With tensions in Europe at an all-time high, with disputes around colonial possessions, conflicting interests, and the naval race all leading back to the new powerhouse in Europe's center, the imbalance of powers was way too strong, and things had to be settled one way or another. With the Austrian declaration of war on Serbia after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand as the flick of the trigger, it was predetermined that Germany would stand behind Austria's actions, as already agreed. The Triple Alliance was reassurance for Austria that they could recklessly impose hegemony in the Balkan Peninsula, or so they thought. Germany had Austria's back, but other alliances existed too. Russia, seen as the protector of Slavic peoples in Europe and the Balkans, stepped in for Serbia, who had previously received a crazy ultimatum with impossible-to-meet demands, which basically gave them no choice. Russia had an alliance with France and was later on joined by Great Britain and Italy. Germany, on the other hand, was supported by the Ottomans and later on Bulgaria. The war was fought on two fronts, with Germany being active in both as the leader of the Central Powers. In the West, Germany fought France with the infamous and bloody trench warfare. They stood in a stalemate from 1914 till 1918, with ferocious battles that made the lines move a few hundred meters at its best. With the trenches still, and millions of lives left to the worst of inhumane conditions, from the North Sea all the way down to the Swiss border, the North Sea itself was blockaded by the British throughout the war, which sharply reduced Germany's ability to access raw materials and food, leading to enormous food and equipment scarcity. The fighting on the Eastern Front was much more open, with the German and Austrian armies winning decisive victories against the Russians, such as the infamous Battle of Tannenberg. The Russian war machinery was largely ineffective and overwhelmed because of the inner turmoil which ultimately led to the February Revolution and the withdrawal of the Russian Empire from the war with heavy consequences. With the extremely harsh Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany was promptly given control over Eastern Europe. With the eradication of the Russian threat from the war, Germany could now concentrate its forces on the Western Front, giving it a clear numerical advantage over the Allies. Despite the high hopes and a promising beginning, the advancements on the Western Front didn't come as quickly as expected, and before you know it, the Allies started regrouping despite initial struggles, and American forces started arriving in the tens of thousands a day. Unable to consolidate their gains, famine and food shortages heavily hitting the civilians in the army, and with their military reserves completely exhausted through the British blockade, only multiple Allied offensives were needed to destroy the German army. Additionally, towards the end of the war, the entire European population had to endure the Spanish flu pandemic, which affected almost 1/5 of the entire world population and killed at least 50 million people in Europe alone. The absolute inner downfall of the empire started in October 1918, when the German Navy refused to set sail for a last, desperate large-scale operation, which would end up in a tragedy as the war was already lost. The uprisings led to more and more revolts across the entire country, as the military was no longer loyal to the Kaiser, and so was nobody else. The Kaiser and all the ruling princes abdicated, and on November the 8th, 1918, the German Republic was proclaimed by Philipp Scheidemann. Although this followed by the proclamation of the Free Socialist Republic by communist politician Karl Liebknecht only 2 hours later, which led to him being brutally murdered by the Freikorps after the Spartacus uprising. The surrender of Germany and its allies came before the Allies managed to bring the war into German territory, which will later be characterized as treacherous and cowardly and lead to the so-called Dolchstoßlegende, a conspiracy theory, if you will, that the German military apparatus had been compromised from the inside by political enemies, including the communists and Democrats, despite being able to win the war. The controversial surrender was followed by an even more controversial peace agreement, the Treaty of Versailles of 1919, which loaded a big bag of explosives on Germany's back, which was ready to explode at any minute. The treaty was extremely accusatory towards Germany, laying the complete responsibility or Alleinschuld on the empire for the entire war. Germany was painted as the devil, demilitarized, its economy highly damaged, vast amounts of territory taken, including 10% of the population, its entire colonial possessions dismissed, and forced to repay enormous war reparations, which they finally completely paid back only recently. The Versailles Vertrag, with its cruelty, ended up laying the perfect breeding ground for ultranationalists and fascists in the upcoming years, as the people were overwhelmingly opposed to the new Weimar Republic and had to live with the harsh consequences of World War I. Democracy was something new that many people, including those in power, never experienced and were therefore strongly skeptical and against it, making the newly formed Weimar Republic a democracy without democrats, which was destined to collapse under the enormous dissatisfaction and suffering of the masses, who needed a hero who can bring revenge for the German people and bring Germany back to its old glory. The dangerously fragile democracy was constantly under pressure from extremist groups from both the left and the right, which increasingly gained power as people were more and more desperate. On one side, the German Communist Party founded by the KPD, and on the other side the DNVP, or the German National Peoples Party, and later on the infamous NSDAP. The first military assault on the democracy took place in Berlin with the Kapp Putsch, when Wolfgang Kapp marched to Berlin with volunteers from the Freikorps. This coup d'etat was unsuccessful, but was the first warning sign of what is to come in the future. The Weimar Constitution, or the Weimarer Verfassung, was, alongside the Treaty of Versailles, the decisive factor that helped the National Socialist Party with Adolf Hitler to gain power. The heavily imbalanced government structure, with a very powerful presidential figure strongly resembling the old Kaiser, which was able to dissolve the parliament and dismiss civil rights, was a ticking time bomb, ready to be snatched from either the left or the right. The final warning came in the form of the Hitler Putsch, where the leader of the National Socialist Party, Adolf Hitler, alongside Erich Ludendorff, attempted to, with the support of 2,000 Nazi soldiers, seize power in Munich, Bavaria. This attempt failed, and Hitler was arrested. He spent the time in prison, writing his extremely infamous book, Mein Kampf, where he publishes National Socialist sentiments to the nation, which were very soon about to shape the world as we know it. Upon his return from prison, Hitler redirected his focus to retain power through legal means and used the constructive mistakes of the Weimar Constitution to his advantage. After gaining a lot of media attention and popularity among the general population, which started supporting his radical nationalist principles, convinced by his theatrical speeches and fiery words of encouragement, Hitler's NSDAP started winning enormous numbers of votes. With Paul von Hindenburg as Reichskanzler, Hitler managed to come to power with a set of manipulative, ingenious moves. The banning of communist parties in the parliament, nationwide arresting campaigns, the Enabling Act of the Weimar Constitution, burning down the Reichstag building and the Reichstag Fire Decree, which dismissed most German civil liberties, rights of assembly and freedom of press, and the passing of laws that directly violated the Constitution. Before you know it, a centralized totalitarian state was established, which was no longer part of the League of Nations. A full-blown dictatorship rose to prominence with the Schutzstaffel, Sturmabteilung, and Gestapo controlling every centimeter of the country, without many seeming to notice or be concerned. Hitler seemed like the heroic leader Germany craved for. It all seemed dreamlike and utopian for the romanticized Aryan race promoted by Hitler, who himself couldn't look any less Aryan, but for the political opponents, despised minorities and religious groups, life was about to take a horror-like turn. The main conversation when talking about the Nazi regime revolves around the discrimination, segregation, and execution of unwanted minorities, who were given the nickname Untermensch, or lower being. These included the Jewish population, which was through centuries portrayed and demonized as secretive, manipulative, and plain evil. The physically and mentally disabled and homosexuals, who according to the Nazis aren't worthy of living, the Roma population, also called gypsies, as well as the Slavs and other ethnicities which were seen as hierarchically subordinate to the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Germanic peoples of the north. What made Hitler the insane person as we view him today was his obsession with cleanliness and order. From the harmless, OCD-like behavior from his everyday life, this transferred to a systematic, nationwide ethnic cleansing campaign of those which he directly viewed and characterized as insects and parasites. The Nazis were the most hostile towards the Jews, which were a target of endless propaganda attacks and later on inhumane persecutions and mass genocide. This went so far that sexual relations were banned between Jews and Germans, and those with Jewish blood, even 2 generations back, were not considered citizens and were stripped off of all human rights. All Germans of Jewish origin had their documents stamped with a big letter J, and given the mandatory middle name of either Sarah or Israel, which they were referred as in school and everyday life. The propaganda machinery nested itself even in mandatory education, where the Rassenlehre, or the subject of racial hierarchy, taught children through pseudoscience about Hitler's Aryan supremacist fantasies. With this, last pieces of humanity were systematically stripped off of the Jewish population. The Nuremberg Laws of 1933, the Kristallnacht pogrom of 1938, and the opening of the first concentration camp in Dachau, Germany, were the last warnings for the 250,000 Jews, which saw what was coming and fled the country before it was too late. Hitler's diplomatic policies included blackmailing targets to fulfill his demands, withdrawal from the League of Nations in 1933, rejection of the Versailles Treaty and the remilitarization of the country and the Rhineland in 1935, Formation of the Axis alliance with Mussolini's Italy and massive military aid to Franco in the Spanish Civil War, the annexation or Anschluss of Austria and the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1938, and the formation of a peace pact with Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union in 1939. All this set the stage for the catastrophe waiting on Europe's doorstep. Something had to go wrong, and so it did. In the conquest for Lebensraum, Hitler and his army came to invade and conquer Poland, Denmark and Norway, the Low Countries, and with the fall of Paris and occupation of France all in the same year, Hitler gained even more popularity and an upsurge in war fever, and the belief that Germany could actually conquer all of Europe and then the world. The first part almost completely came true, as Hitler and his allies, at this point in time, controlled a huge portion of the continent. But that wasn't enough for him, so he decided to do the same mistake made by Napoleon more than 100 years earlier. He invaded the Soviet Union. After the swift invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece in 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa, where the German troops conquered all of Eastern Europe and arrived up to the gates of Moscow by the end of the year, which again would be according to his initial wishes of wanting the vast lands of Eastern Russia for the ever-increasing German population. But that, once again, wasn't enough. In the wake of the increasingly harsh Battle of Moscow, the Japanese issued an attack on Pearl Harbor, which drew the United States of America into the war. The failed siege of Moscow and the intervention of the United States proved to be a turning point in the war and for the future of Germany. What also followed was one of the most devastating and bloodiest battles in history, with almost 2 million casualties: the Battle of Stalingrad. After the Soviets won this battle, a full-scale counterattack was issued on the Eastern Front. On the other hand, British, French, Canadian, and American troops were closing in through northern Africa, and the invasions of Sicily and Normandy, infamously known as D-Day, as Hitler's troops couldn't recover from the fiasco in Russia. The harsh winter and Soviet guerrilla attacks effectively destroyed the German supply lines, as even the oil in the trucks' reservoirs started freezing. Enthusiasm and morale were slowly depleting, as the Allies were liberating more and more occupied countries, and especially among the civilian population in Germany, as Allied strategic bombings of German cities left 353,000 civilians dead and 9 million homeless. The era of Nazi mass tyranny was slowly coming to an end, with the Allied reconquest revealing the horrendous reality of the Nazi ideology. Concentration camps, mass genocide and ethnic cleansing, and all the horrors and wounds the Holocaust left behind on the European continent. Nazi Germany collapsed with the arrival of the Red Army in Berlin. Hitler committed suicide on April the 30th, 1945, and Germany officially surrendered on May the 8th of the same year. What the Nazis left behind was a side of terror which is to be remembered and frowned upon in generations to come. World War II left not only Germany and Europe in ruins, with 60 million military and civilian casualties, but also left unhealable wounds of the Jewish society, which lost at least 6 million of its people through the horrors of the Holocaust. Other ethnic groups, such as the Sinti and Roma, as well as Slavs, most notably Serbs in the Balkans, as well as Poles and Russians, give an additional 11 million civilian casualties. For Germany, the war went from a fairy tale to a nightmare in an instant. The defeat in World War II resulted in the complete destruction of Germany's political and economic infrastructure and full occupation by the Allied forces for decades to come. Millions of German refugees had to return to the mainland due to the Soviet reoccupation. Some were expelled, some were forced to do labor as an unofficial way to pay for war reparations for what the Nazi state had done to Europe. The expulsions and suppression of the Volksdeutsche led to the deaths of at least 2 million people. The Potsdamer Conference of August 1945 served as a blueprint of what is to become of the shackled-up German nation, the so-called 5 Ds: denazification, demilitarization, decentralization, demontage, and democracy. The East was occupied by the Soviets and from 1949 existed under the name Deutsche Demokratische Republik, or DDR, and was part of the Eastern Bloc during the upcoming Cold War. It's commonly characterized as a communist satellite, officially as a socialist workers' and peasant state. This zone also included East Berlin, whereas the western part of the city was split between the Allies and surrounded by the Soviet zone. The West was divided into a British, American, and French occupation zone, and existed under the name of the Bonn Republic, or officially Bundesrepublik Deutschland. Consequently, it belonged to the Western Bloc during the Cold War, but enjoyed much greater autonomy and freedoms than the Soviet satellite. It is generally known to have been wealthier and more prosperous than East Germany, where Moscow's grip was felt on the economy, societal and political freedoms, and all aspects of life. In short, East Germany was a dictatorship, whereas the West was free to flourish under Allied supervision. With the means of denazification, most top officials of the old regime were removed, imprisoned, and executed. Demilitarization meant just that, disabling the German war machine to a subordinate and dependent role until the Allies decide they're to be trusted. Demontage referred to the allocation of vast German territories to surrounding countries, whereas the decentralization included a rewriting of the German Constitution, with the goal of spreading and balancing political power on several institutions, so that never again can one person physically be able to exploit the law and to gain so much power. Germany was to be divided into 16 highly autonomous federal states, or Bundesländer, each with its own politics and influence. Additionally, power was to be stripped off the head of state, or the Bundespräsident, and balanced between the Bundestag, Bundesrat, Bundesverfassungsgericht, and other organs, with democracy as the main cornerstone of the German state. Despite the efforts of the Allies to keep Germany on the ground and under control, the Truman administration in America realized that economic recovery in Europe could not go forward without a strong, stable, and productive Germany, which European prosperity itself was always dependent on. Strong economical support was issued with the Marshall Plan in the form of loans and assets, with the goal of reviving Germany and Europe from the dead. During the Cold War and the years of division, Germany saw the doubling of industrial production with the so-called economic miracle, a currency reform, and an upsurge of guest workers from all around Europe, which came to aid the rampant growth of the German economy, which would enter a crisis in the 1970s, accompanied by rapid inflation. Germany in the Cold War saw several political shifts, with the likes of Konrad Adenauer, Ludwig Erhard, Kurt Kiesinger, and most notably Willy Brandt, who, as Chancellor of West Germany, did steps in improving relations with the Soviet Union, and therefore East Germany, with this Ostpolitik, which many view as a key step for the upcoming unification of Germany. The man who orchestrated the reunification, however, was Helmut Kohl, who soon became the first chancellor of a reunified Germany. The final German unification was ultimately a result of rapid changes during the summer of 1989 in East Germany, known as the Peaceful Revolution or Die Wende. Besides the growing desire among many Germans, especially those imprisoned in the inferior Soviet satellite of East Germany, to once again see their long-lost relatives and brothers from the West, one of the key moments which opened up the gates for a German unification was the weakening and inevitable collapse of the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union. This led to the fall of the Iron Curtain, dividing the East and the West, which allowed many Germans from the East to seek refuge in the open gates of Hungary and Czechia, with the goal of eventually reaching West Germany. The world was an uncertain place, struck by an avalanche of change, which the East German government could not deal with. The ever-increasing pressure forced Chancellor Erich Honecker to resign from office in October. Suddenly, the gates were open for travel between the East and West, which came as completely unexpected for everyone who was watching the live broadcast on the 9th of November 1989, when the freedom of movement was announced. German authorities let hundreds of thousands of East Germans cross the border, and several crossing points were opened in the Berlin Wall itself. This event is known as the Fall of the Berlin Wall. What was important, though, is that decades of exodus and tyranny had ended for the German people, who witnessed the formal unification of the Bundesrepublik Deutschland on October 3, 1990. With the Wiedervereinigung, the Schröder and current Merkel administration built up on the foundation set by the Allies after the fall of the Nazi regime. Germany was to be built up as the backbone of European economy and society, as the central gear of European trade, politics, and balance of power. As one of the founders of the European coal and steel community as West Germany, and what was to become the European Union, power was indefinitely balanced and highly dependent on the now highly developed, productive, and self-aware Germany, which serves as a prime example of how to honestly and objectively deal with one's past, accept it, learn from its mistakes, and educate the new generation on how, when, and what went wrong, and do everything to prevent such an occurrence in the future. Some would say that Germany had become a cowardly, auto-chauvinist, self-shaming shadow of its former self, being indecisive while indirectly paying for the debt from 75 years ago by accepting ungodly numbers of refugees and immigrants while being restricted and afraid to show its actual pride. The resurgence of far-right political parties such as the AfD in the German parliament and the increasingly polarized political scene due to controversial action of the Merkel administration surrounding the refugee crisis and other related topics sparks fear in some that Germany may be on a path to at least mildly start taking a radical stance towards some issues. Yet we must not forget one fact. Whereas there is always room for improvement, the first world problems of modern German society may not be as dramatic as hunger, looming wars and ethnic problems, unemployment, oppression, and the corruption the rest of the world is facing. Germany is and will stay one of the leading powers in the world in terms of everything, and that is something to be proud of.